this meeting to order with authority. Welcome to meeting number 132 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. I'd like to remind all members of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name prior to speaking, and a reminder that all comments should be addressed through that of the chair. And certainly thank you all for your cooperation in advance. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 25th, 2024, the committee will continue with its study of gender-based violence and femicides against women, girls, and gender-diverse people. Before we welcome our witnesses, I would like to provide this trigger warning. We will be discussing experiences related to violence and femicides. This indeed may be triggering to some viewers with similar experiences. If at any point any participants feel distressed or need help, please advise the clerk. For all witnesses and members of Parliament, it's very important to recognize that these are very difficult discussions, and indeed it is incumbent on all of us to be as compassionate as possible. For today's panel, I would like to introduce as an individual Esther Ullman, Association des familles des personnes assassinées ou disparues, l'Honorable Pierre-Hugues Boisvenu.
The Honorable Pierre-Hugues Boisvenu, the Administrator and former Senator.
Olga Voyer, Advocacy Coordinator. At this point, we will be beginning our opening statements. Ms. Ullman, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Esther Ullman. Thank you for having me here and taking the time to listen to my family's story. I'm here to talk about my aunt and namesake, Esther Jones. Esther went by the name Esty, so to me she was Aunt Esty. Aunt Esty was number 9 of 15 children. Growing up in a large family cultivated Aunt Esty into a spirited and caring person. As a child, I remember following her around, trying to be just like my aunt, who I shared my name with. She always had bags of candy on hand to give treats to her students, as well as her many nieces and nephews. She was passionate about family, faith, animal rights, and music. She took her undergrad degree in music and hoped to pursue her master's, but this opportunity was robbed from her. On August 31st, all Aunt Esty's hopes, dreams, and potential futures were stolen from her. My aunt was the victim of a brutal homicide. Aunt Esty's final day was spent simply living her life. She hoped to continue doing what she loved, teaching the piano. She was keeping things as normal as possible as she coped with the loss of her mother, who had died just a few weeks prior. Aunt Esty entered her piano studio in the afternoon. This is where she was last seen. Police have confirmed that she was killed on the night of August 31st. Her remains have not been recovered. Aunt Esty's earthly journey ended on the night of August 31st, but my family's journey was only beginning. On September 2nd, my family all connected, realizing that no one had spoken to Aunt Esty since Saturday. Aunt Mary filed a missing persons report. On September 4th, Aunt Esty's vehicle was located near the scene of her last known location. The Major Crime Unit took over the investigation, and on September the 11th, the Southwest Major Crime Unit charged Dale Allen Toole of Tremont, Annapolis County with first-degree murder in relation to Aunt Esty's disappearance. The heartbreaking emotions experienced by my family and I during the weeks following Aunt Esty's disappearance are unexplainable. There was a sense of urgency, stress, guilt, and also subconscious preparation for the worst-case scenario. From the beginning, many of us had that gut feeling that this would not end well, but felt a sense of guilt for not maintaining hope. I subconsciously could not maintain hope because I had to prepare myself for what has become my family's reality. Our loved one was the victim of a homicide, and we will live with that forever. When my family was first informed that Aunt Esty had been murdered, I pledged to my mom and dad that I will do everything in my power to prevent this from happening to another innocent family. I will do what I can to protect innocent women like my Aunt Esty. My aunt's alleged killer was not a first-time offender. Just 2 years ago, the accused committed and was convicted of another unprovoked violent crime against another woman. That time the victim was his little sister. He was convicted of choking an individual and committing an assault, and assault causing bodily harm. He was not jailed as part of the sentence for this crime. He was given a brief conditional sentence with a curfew at night and a short period of probation. I have seen no evidence that this inadequate sentence reformed or rehabilitated him. Instead, he was free and is now being charged with killing my aunt. Aunt Estie's alleged killer was free because of crime legislation that prioritized Dale over his previous assault victim. Legislation like Bill C-5 removed mandatory minimum sentencing on some violent crimes. Because no mandatory minimum sentencing was in place, Dale was not sentenced to jail time nor properly monitored. Because of our flawed justice system, my aunt is dead. Actions have consequences. The legislators of Bill C-5 may have had the best of intentions, but that did not protect the innocent. My Aunt Estie died because of this type of pro-offender, anti-victim legislation. I'm here to demand change for past and future victims. I do not need your sympathy. Do not tell me that you're sorry for my loss unless you're prepared to prioritize protecting victims in the future. Thank you for listening to my family's story. I hope this helps you to improve policies to protect innocent women from unspeakable violence like my family has experienced.
Thank you very much for your testimony. At this point, l'honorable Beauvenu, vous avez la parole pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Boisvenu, you have 5 minutes now. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's very appreciated. So, first of all, the association that I represent was created in 2004, and it represents numerous families who have lost a loved one or whose loved one has disappeared. It was created by 4 fathers of daughters who were killed. And the aim is to eliminate violence against women. So today I'm the voice of thousands of neglected women in our justice system. I'm also the voice of thousands of police and prison officers who no longer recognize themselves in our public safety systems, which has become lax, where only criminals are at the heart of decisions to the detriment of those who work hard to counter violence. You know how the safety of all Canadians has been at the heart of my life's mission for over 22 years. Ever since my daughter Julie was murdered by a repeat offender. For all those years, my priority has been to make elected officials across Canada aware of the scourge of the violence against women, and all too often their children. My experience of 14 years in the Senate has convinced me that raising awareness is the only way to bring about the legislative changes that will ensure greater safety for women in our communities. And as I mentioned in my farewell speech from the Senate last February, steps have been taken in this direction. The adoption of the Charter of Rights of Victims of Crime, which recognizes fundamental rights for victims, including the right to protection, is just one example. Now, despite this, between 2018 and 2022, the number of women murdered in Canada rose by nearly 60%, from 118 in 2019 to 184 in 2022. That's as many women murdered as is in France in 2022, even though that country is twice the population of Canada. How can we explain that in 2024, women will have to expend so much energy to be listened to, heard, and understood? How can we explain that my bill S-205, imposing electronic bracelets on violent women released from prison and requiring them to undergo therapy to reduce the recidivism of violent acts, has been, here in the House of Commons, and I'm going to use the word butchered? That bill was the minimum that thousands of women had been asking from Parliament for years. It was unreservedly supported by all provincial justice ministers, by First Nations groups, by federations of shelters for abused women, and by therapists. I don't understand why in 2024, when there are modern, pre-formed tools to ensure women's safety, it's still so difficult to convince the country's legislators to act on this. As an example, I've been working for several years with a private company and hundreds of women in Quebec to ensure their safety after receiving threats of assault and death. The system works, people feel safe, or women feel safe rather, and some have been able to sound the alarm and avoid being attacked. The costs of this security system are even reimbursed to the women by the Quebec government. The contradiction is that they don't want to officially recognize it, which would undoubtedly increase its use and ensure the safety of even more women. Another recent example of poor protection for women in Canada. 10 years ago in Candiac, a 27-year-old woman, a leading researcher in engineering, was murdered by her husband. A spouse with a history of violence and awaiting trial was in court because of death threats against his wife. He was released by the court, and 1 hour later, he murdered her. And yet last year, you passed Bill C-233, authorizing the courts to make it mandatory to wear an electronic bracelet in such cases, which would have saved this woman's life. So why did the court remain so passive? Despite these important legislative changes, I can see that they are difficult to put into action. When it comes to the safety of women victims, we continue to act today as we did 20 years ago, believing that a simple denunciation to a police department is enough to keep victims safe. The reality is quite different, and the aggressors know it. When you return 40% of the aggressors to their living rooms, you know what the most serious consequence is: the disengagement of police. And this disengagement is the worst threat to women's safety, because the law has trivialized violence against women. What a gain for them. So if society wants to take action against violence against women, so for example, by amending Bill C-5, which is in total contradiction with provincial efforts to prevent all forms of violence against women, we need to toughen up the criminal code when women are murdered. Today, in such situations, killers can be released after 5 or 6 years in prison. So in fact, Bill S-255 goes in this direction, and I hope it will soon be studied by the Senate. So as you can see, it's not just our laws that will protect women, it's our justice system that will, above all, apply those laws. Thank you, and I'm now ready to take your questions.
Merci beaucoup pour votre déclaration d'ouverture.
Thank you very much for your words.
I would like to welcome Ms. Auger-Voyer. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Valérie Auger-Voyer, and I'm the Advocacy Coordinator at the Ending Violence Association of Canada. We're a national organization that works collaboratively with our members on the ground to provide a unified pan-Canadian voice for the issue of sexual violence. Our members are provincial and territorial networks of sexual assault centers and other gender-based violence organizations. I'm here to tell you about the significant role that sexual violence plays in femicide and how to begin addressing this. Femicide discussions have traditionally centered around intimate partner violence, but sexual violence and femicide are deeply interconnected, both in intimate partner and non-intimate partner femicides. In fact, sexual violence is recognized as both an indicator and a risk factor for femicide. So women who experience sexual violence in intimate partner relationships report significantly more risk factors for femicide when there is sexual violence, as well as death threats. In cases involving non-intimate partner perpetrators and sexual violence, young women and sex workers are at higher risk. Yet, gaps in data collection limit our ability to fully capture the role of sexual violence and femicide. The Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability has highlighted the need for more data on the prevalence and patterns of sexual violence and femicides. We know that gender-based violence and femicides stem from the same structural inequities that render certain groups disproportionately vulnerable to sexual violence. So in particular, we can think of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, sex workers, young women, 2S LGBTQIA+ individuals, women with disabilities, who all face higher risks of violence. Therefore, Any policy discussions, data collection, and solutions must start with a broad, inclusive definition of femicide, one that captures not only the lethal act, but also the power dynamics that are involved, as well as the underlying disparities and conditions that enable it. A definition must also be inclusive and reflective of those most at risk, including gender diverse individuals. In terms of responses to sexual violence, we know that carceral responses are not working for most survivors. The fact that only 6% of sexual assaults are reported to the police means that most survivors do not turn to the criminal justice system, and those who do often feel re-victimized. And further, the system over-criminalizes marginalized groups, which in turn reinforces the inequities that allow violence to thrive in the first place. So instead, we echo the calls of the Mass Casualty Commission to shift the focus to community-based responses that center survivors' well-being and prevent violence. This includes strengthening social infrastructure to tackle root causes of violence and investing in community-based frontline organizations that provide essential services to survivors. Although efforts have been made by the federal government in the last few years through the National Action Plan, significant service gaps remain. We have found that the National Action Plan funding is not sufficient to stabilize the sector, and it's also not reaching sexual assault centers consistently or adequately across Canada. Making meaningful progress in addressing sexual violence and femicide will require large-scale, sustained, and coordinated efforts across jurisdictions. So we urge the federal government to rely on the expertise of our sector and also to put in place an independent gender-based violence commissioner to help move things forward and provide accountability. So I have 4 recommendations. 1, establish a comprehensive data collection mechanism for femicides that specifically identifies and tracks sexual violence as a key risk factor and also captures the societal conditions that lead to sexual violence and femicide. 2, urgently implement the 231 calls for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and invest in initiatives that support communities that are structurally marginalized, such as Indigenous communities, Black, racialized, trans individuals, and women with disabilities. 3, ensure that the National Action Plan adequately funds community-based survivor-serving organizations, such as sexual assault centers. And 4, establish an independent gender-based violence commissioner. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for your opening remarks. At this point, we will begin with our first round of questions. Michelle, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. Very, very tough conversations as this is women's lives that we're talking about. And Esther, I just want to tell you, your auntie would be just so darn proud of you. What a testimony. You literally just said everything that needed to be said, and it was very, very powerful. Thank you. Senator, it's pretty special to have you sit beside Esther, you know, losing your daughter Julie and fighting your entire career to restore justice so that killers aren't walking free. It was actually 1 year ago to the day that you were in Status of Women presenting Bill S-205. And I want to talk about that. But the big thing that I think people need to know what you've done, Senator, among all of the things that you've done, is the Victim Bill of Rights. In 2015, you were able to get 2 chambers to unanimously support this. And this was to restore the rights of victims so that victims have more rights in this country than criminals. And it was to be revised in 2020 by the Liberals, but it was never done. And I'm curious why you believe it was never done, and if you believe that the justice system has failed on its obligation to all of the women who have died since 2020 when it hasn't been revised.
J'aimerais juste que vous précisiez.
I just want you to clarify.
So the Victim Bill of Rights that you created and
Yeah.
had passed, it was to be revised in 2020, but it has never been revised. What impact does this have on victims?
Une charte des droits, que ce soit la charte des
The Bill of Rights, whether it's the Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the Victim Bill of Rights, it's a vehicle, it's a tool. It's a vehicle with 4 wheels and a motor.
De mettre de
And it's up to legislators to put gas in that vehicle so that it can operate. And so what we did with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, people felt that people were not feeling respected. When they didn't feel respected, they went to court, and the court makes a decision based on an interpretation. The Jordan decision that limits delays in court cases flows from the Charter. The Victim Bill of Rights was adopted in 2015. The Liberal government, which arrived in 2015, had the responsibility to make that bill evolve based on the complaints that were sent to the ombudsman, and who.
Sauf que personne au gouvernement, entre autres,
But nobody in government or the Minister of Justice, who had the responsibility to develop that Victim Bill of Rights, nobody in government looked after improving that bill. I had to table bills in the Senate to give substance to the Bill of Rights. So for an example, a family called me at one point, and they learned that the killer of their daughter, who was in prison, who had access to Facebook, and that he'd been putting photos of the victim on his Facebook page. So the family turned to Facebook, and it took 6 months, an article in the newspaper, and my intervention so that Facebook turned that page off. So what does protection mean? It doesn't mean just protecting a life. It also means protecting a victim's identity, their personal life. So what improvements needed to be made since 2015? We need a process. There's no process for studying complaints in the Bill of Rights, but there is one for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Perfectly. The Victim Bill of Rights is there, but it is not enforceable at this point to actually protect the victims. Ironically, again, having you here, the timing today when we have, Debbie Mahaffey and Donna French, who are the mothers of Leslie and Kristen, who were murdered by Paul Bernardo, who have been denied to appear at his parole board. I mean, you and I talked about this. This is going to have implications. It could implicate you in your situation with your daughter. Can you explain what this means when we hear this, that they're not allowed to go and testify on behalf of their daughter and say their piece to the man who murdered and raped their children?
vous amenez un très bel exemple.
No, that's a great example. In the regulation, criminals have a right to move the hearing, and victims have to accept the decision of the criminal, and they have to follow. So, for example, there was a criminal in BC, very well known, Wilson.
La commission.
There was 30 hearings, but the criminal never prepared, but the victims would get ready, and he would always at the last minute decide not to go, and he was never sanctioned for that. In the Bernardo case, the victims were not able to attend the hearing set by the criminal, but the commission said no.
3 ans. Et là,
So the commission phoned me, and there was a hearing in my daughter's killer's case, and the commission said, "Are you available?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to be in the country." And they wanted me to make arrangements to follow the hearing by victims. So the rights of victims and the criminals are not equal, and yet the Victim Bill of Rights says that victims have the right to participate. And what that means that if the criminal is there physically, victims should be able to be there physically as well. So, but in the House of Commons says that the commission is independent, but that's not true.
Thank you. Next, MP Demoff, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. And I understand I'm supposed to call you Mr. Boisvenu now, not Senator Boisvenu, but whatever it is, I want to thank you so much for your service to this country and all the work that you've done as a senator. I want to just start by clarifying something, and I'm certainly not here to defend parole board decisions because they are independent from the government, but I have seen that the parole board is reconsidering having the families appear in person, which in my opinion, is a good decision, and enough about that. Ms. Voyer, I have a few questions for you. You mentioned the need to make sure that any definitions are inclusive, and I remember listening to a podcast by Julie Lalonde during the pandemic about how senior women are always left out of programming. There's a silent pandemic at the time. It was a silent pandemic of gender-based violence against senior women. They often are more at risk because of finances and being financially dependent on their husbands. And I just wonder if you have any comment on that, any research that you might be able to share to speak to seniors who seem to be left out of a lot of the work that we do when it comes to gender-based violence.
Hi, thank you for your question. So I think you're absolutely right. Senior women are often left out of conversations on gender-based violence, and in fact, there are fewer services when it comes to. Services are generally available for women of all ages, usually 16 plus. However, they don't necessarily specialize in the things that are relevant for senior women. So like you mentioned, there's financial dependence, there might be disabilities, there might be isolation, there might be abuse happening by care attendants. So those are the kinds of things, especially the sexual abuse by, in long-term care homes. And those are the things that we don't talk about enough. And I do think there's a lack of data on that. So, for example, we know that there's already a lack of data on sexual femicides, but we know that sexual femicides target younger women. But there's very little on whether that happens to older women. We tend to just pretend that that doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I mean, seniors are also, there's a greater stigma just given the way they've been brought up and their age in even reaching out for assistance. I want to talk about the courts a little bit. I was really proud to work on Kira's law, and I was also part of Bill C3, I think it was. It was Ronna Ambrose's bill on education for judges. Now, we know we can't mandate judges to get into education. Would you comment on the need for judges to be better educated on issues of coercive control and gender-based violence, and should the educating bodies be doing a better job of ensuring that judges are up to date on current research on the issue?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, it is.
So important for judges to be better educated on gender-based violence, sexual violence in particular. I would say we need to go further upstream, like as upstream as possible, and start with, everyone who's studying to be a lawyer should have courses on gender-based violence, on domestic violence, sexual violence, to really understand these dynamics. Because what we're seeing is that in courts, family courts, for example, these matters when there's domestic violence happening are being called high conflict, right? Like as if the power dynamics were not existing. And we keep hearing decisions from judges that just show that they don't understand those dynamics or the issues involved in sexual violence. So, we hear rhetoric that is victim blaming, that is stigmatizing, that is re-victimizing. And so, yes, education for judges, lawyers, police officers, and every actor involved in the justice system would be.
Yeah, and I'm really proud of Jennifer Kagan, who has really pushed this issue provincially, because the education for police and children's aid societies, a lot Crown prosecutors, is all rests with provincial governments. So we now have it in Ontario, Nova Scotia. Hopefully Manitoba comes on board, but I think for all provinces and territories to really really push this. One of the other things that came up in a previous meeting, and I only have about 30 seconds left, is the survivors of a sexual assault don't have representation in court. The Crown represents the Crown, defense represents the assailant. Do you think that they should have representation in court?
That is one of our main recommendations, is free legal advice and representation for survivors of sexual assaults.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Damoff. Next, MP LaRouche, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Boisvenu, Ms. Ullman, and Ms. Auger-Voyer. Thank you for being here to speak to us, and in honor of all those people who have been lost. I'm going to start my first question with you, Mr. Boisvenu.
Vous l'avez.
Now, not in your opening statements, but you mentioned this when you were answering questions from Member Ferrari. Now, we tabled a bill that we want to be debated in the House of Commons so that there are no longer any situations that criminals are not released without a trial. And witnesses for this study talked about the importance of the bill and to apply Jordan's decision. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. So that criminals can't just be released for a simple reason of delay.
Vous avez tout à fait raison. D'abord, merci pour la question.
You're right. The error was first committed by the Supreme Court, and I think the court. Now in Quebec, there were 3 people who were returned returned home after killing people, and they never had a trial. So it's unacceptable in Canadian society to just let killers return home without any punishment. And they're not part of the statistics, because for it to be one of the statistics, you have to be charged and convicted. But there are 60,000 cases that have been rejected because of Jordan's principle. So I think that Parliament has to come back on this. Come back to this rather. Now there's nothing worse than to see a criminal come back into a neighborhood without consequences.
60% plus.
So, no, I said earlier that there has been a 60% increase in murder of women, and a number are in domestic situations, and almost 75% of cases there was a previous history of violence. So if we don't settle that issue caused by Jordan's principle, listen, I don't know. We're making assault against women a banal thing.
Vous l'avez dit, ces questions, c'est important, cette question.
Yeah, this is a very important question, as you said, and it's very important to settle this issue related to Jordan's principle. I think it contributes to a loss of trust in the justice system. People are losing trust. Dan, did you have anything to say about that? This loss of trust in the public justice system? I've been in close connection with police for the last 20 years with carceral prison officers as well. And what I've been seeing in the last few years is disengagement. So when a police officer arrests someone because they assaulted a woman, and then all of a sudden, 2 hours after their trial, he's allowed to go home. It doesn't motivate police to do anything.
Crime qu'on a
So there are types of crimes that we cannot, to return someone home after, it's not taking the situation seriously. So you're right. So the basis of our judicial system is the trust that victims have in the judicial system. Now, you talked about disengagement among police officers, and so here's a question for you. Now, this summer, I met the family of the first femicide that took place in Granby, rather. And that's how my year started. I had to hear that, I heard that sad story. So I met with that family this summer. And I also met with a police officer from the local detachment who was in charge of crimes against women. And so we were able to discuss. So, or rather, I'm going to be meeting this person. So what should I be asking him? What kind of questions should I be asking him? Oh, that's not an easy question. This is very difficult work for the police to do, when it comes to domestic violence, especially when there are children involved.
Écoutez, moi, ce que je dis à ces policiers-là,
So listen, what I would say, these officers do this every day, and their two main missions is to deal with mental health, or the main things that they deal with is mental health and domestic violence. And I think it's about 80% of their workload. They deal with the most difficult situations, people dealing with mental health issues and domestic violence, because you're there with a couple that are assaulting each other, or most of the time it's men doing the assaults. So I would make sure that, I'm sure that these police officers that they're, who have spent their entire shift with people who are aggressive, I think they do an admirable job.
aller chercher
So encourage that person to go and get help if they need it. They need a good mental health. To start over every morning, it's not an easy thing to do.
MP Kazan, you have.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for coming here today. Good to see you again, Senator. Thank you, Esther, for sharing the story of your family, and Madame Voyer for doing the work that you do. It's difficult work. And I just want to point out before I start asking questions that I think that we're all here. I'm sure you're all here because you want justice. And sometimes we have different opinions on how justice is arrived at, but I think the goal is the same, to get justice. So I want to honor difference, but also a similar goal in all of this. I wanted to start with you, Madame Voyer. One of the things that you said, because your testimony was different than, a little bit different, you said carceral responses do not work. I know that through our study of the red dress, particularly pertaining to Indigenous women, a lot of women won't go to the police because we have a history of either being over-policed or under-policed. And we've also have experiences with systemic racism within the justice system overall, which is what C5 tried to address. I'm certainly not an expert on it, so I don't really want to speak to C5 at all, but I know that was the intention of it. So I wanted you to speak a little bit about the carceral responses and where that opinion comes from for you.
Sure, thank you for the question. So again, so most survivors of sexual assault centers, so we're talking about 94% of sexual assaults are not reported to the police, and for intimate partner violence, only about 20% report to the police. So we really need to take a step back, I think, and look at where are the survivors and where are they going to. So they're going to, family members, community-based organizations, and not necessarily to the criminal justice system. So we've been focusing for years and years on tweaks to the criminal justice system and how that's going to fix gender-based violence, but it doesn't and it hasn't. It's also a reactive approach, so it happens after the violence has been committed, and it's often a punitive approach. And when you talk to survivors, you find out that generally they want accountability, they want the violence to stop, and they want to prevent the violence from happening to someone else. So they don't necessarily want punishment.
So this is I think, so this is where I'm at, is usually by the time the police are involved or the courts are involved, it's too late. I'll give you an example. I'm ground zero for MMIWG. That's where I come from. I live 2 blocks away from where the women that we're currently searching in a landfill were taken by a serial killer. Both women were staying in shelter, meaning they didn't have housing. They did not have a livable income. Prevention, guaranteed livable basic income housing. In Winnipeg, we've never spent so much money on police. With the Winnipegs, we have an extremely high police budget. This is not changing the gender-based violence that are at crisis levels in the community I represent. And you're right, most of the women have a distrust for the justice system. They go to community organizations. Why is it critical, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, to properly fund frontline community organizations if we're serious about saving lives?
Sure, thank you for bringing that up. So yes, we believe that we need to refocus our efforts upstream on prevention, on services, on rehabilitation. And the Mass Casualty Commission report made that very clear, that we need to decenter the carceral responses and really shift our efforts to community-based responses. I can say more on prevention if you like.
Please.
So we really need a multi-pronged approach, and there's 3 things that would be a good start. Is first, funding services for survivors so that they have somewhere to turn to when they need support and they could do safety planning. Second, changing the narrative on gender norms and rape culture, starting in schools with comprehensive sex education that covers consent, healthy relationships, and all those things. And third, address the economic disparities through things like basic income, really the things that make it so, that enable the violence to thrive in the first place. So really looking at housing, income, mental health, et cetera.
So, thank you so much. You also mentioned that the National Action Plan funding is not sufficient. This is something that I noted when it was put in the budget. It's great to see it in the budget, but it's not sufficient, and it's over a number of years. How is not funding gender-based violence prevention costing lives adequately? How is it costing lives?
Well, so I can tell you there are lots of gaps in the National Action Plan. Although it is a promising mechanism, I want to say that it's decades in the making, and it's a promising mechanism for the federal government to invest in the work that's happening on the ground, and 25% of that money is going to prevention. It's not nearly enough. We need billions, not millions. And just as an example of the gaps, there's actually very few sexual assault centers who are even receiving funding through the National Action Plan. So depending on the province and territory, it's a patchwork, again, of who's receiving funding, and a lot of them are not at the moment. And those who are tell us it's insufficient.
Excellent, thank you. Unfortunately, you're out of time. MP Kazan. At this point, I'd like to welcome MP Roberts. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. This is a very difficult situation that we face as a country because we are failing not just the victims, we're also failing the families by not taking this seriously. So I just want to go back to what was said earlier about, it's the decision of the parole board to make the parents of the French and Hamafi testify. That's not correct. Because under Section 6.1 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, the minister can intervene to allow the victims to speak at the parole hearing. So I want to make that clear. It is possible that that can be done by the minister. And the reason I say that is because my question to you, Esther, is about your aunt, and she would be very proud of you. I'm sure she's looking down from heaven and saying, thank God for you, because this situation has to stop. We have to get tough on criminals. That's not happening. Could you please tell me if you think that if we get rid of Bill C-5, where, this catch and release is not working, it's putting women in danger. Do you think that that would be a start in protecting women?
Yeah, I do. So, in my my aunt's case, when he was charged previously, the system focused on him. So he plea bargained and he got a really light sentence, and he was commended for his rehabilitation. He was in therapy. They're like, oh, he's doing such a great job. And they basically, the victim, they were just kind of like, sucks to be you. And I think, the issue with all that I'm hearing right now is the focus is on the offender, rehabilitating him or her, usually him, and giving him hope. But what about my family? What hope do we have? What hope does my aunt have? She's dead. She's gone. And, we can focus all day on, rehabilitation and stuff, but had he been in jail, this wouldn't have happened. She wouldn't be dead.
So, and I agree with you. I think you do the crime, you do the time, especially since in this world today, and we've been studying this situation for many, many months now, we have to change the law. So, Senator, I want to go back to something that just came out, maybe it's been out for a while. So from 2015 to 2019, police services in Canada reported 115,859 sexual assaults. 98% were classified as level 1, and 9 out of 10 of the victims, 89%, were women and girls. How can we continue to protect the women and girls in this world, in this country, if we can't make the crime fit the time?
D'abord, il n'y a pas seulement qu'un moyen.
Well, first, there's not just one means to protect women. There are many means, many ways to protect women. The electronic bracelet, therapy for men is another. We've been sending men who have drinking problems and drug problems to therapy, and especially when a young person is at their has committed a first crime, and it works. It has worked. So we have to do the same thing with violent men. We have to send them to therapy. The problem is that we're working with the consequences of violence, and then we release men. So we have to reverse that. We have to free women, because it's the women who are being imprisoned in sorts. So we have to send the man to therapy. It has to be mandatory. We have to give women the tools to protect themselves. A man that is released, awaiting their trial, what that means is that the woman is imprisoned by fear. So we have to have modern tools. Now that we have cell phones and electronic bracelets, we have tools that we can use, but the judges have to use them. So in that the case that I mentioned about Candiac, 2 hours after being released, the man killed his woman. But we had a bill that was adopted by the Liberal government.
15 au Code criminel, il permet de mettre le bracelet électronique.
So law allows us to use electronic bracelets. So we have to inform judges. I'm trying to understand, how is it that our judges are not aware that these tools exist? How, we release a man who has promised to kill his woman without any supervision. So yes, we have to use them. We have to apply those to men.
Lisa, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. I will say on the record that I too am very concerned that so many court cases are being not heard because the courts can't hear them in time. I'm someone who covered criminal court as a journalist for more than 20 years. I've done stories about the courthouse in Halton Region and how inappropriate it is. And lawyers don't want to go there. It's full of mold. Judges don't want to hold cases there. And the province was supposed to rebuild it and then decided not to. And so these problems are ongoing, and I wish there was more investment in that system. I was also very interested, Ms. Auger-Voyer, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, in a bunch of what you've said. So I'll see how many different things I can get to. First off, you talk about data collection as one of your main goals and one of your main recommendations. I know you've been funded through the department I represent, Women and Gender Equality, to do just that, collect data. Would you please tell us more about that project, what you hope to get out of it? And also, it occurred to me, you said only 6% of survivors report their sexual assault. So how do we even go about collecting this data when so few women are even coming forward to say that they've been affected?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think StatsCan uses self-reporting as well, so not just police reporting, because for sure the police data is very skewed. But what we need in terms of data when it comes to femicides, so basically Statistics Canada's homicide survey at the moment does not capture data on femicides. It only collects some variables related to gender and risk factors for femicide. So that is one huge gap. And then when it does collect data on these things, it can collect whether sexual assault happened at the time of femicide, but it doesn't capture a history of sexual violence, for example. It also does not capture underlying socio-cultural or systemic factors, only individual factors. So we really want more data. At the moment, the data that's been collected by the Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability is basically done by death review committees who are essentially, volunteers or people from the sector who are doing this on the side, and they're using whatever information is available to them. So it could be media reports, and I think we can all agree that those will be incomplete. They don't have access to autopsy reports, for example. So we're really we want data on, was there sexual violence, for example, during, before, or after, the killing? What type of violence was present? And then disaggregated data on different populations and, the relationship there between the sexual violence and the population group. For example, older women, like we said earlier.
Thank you for that. So it's still a big work in progress. I know that you're also funded for another project under Women and Gender Equality. And just for the record, we know that there are gaps and that more than $500 million is not enough to support all of the women's centers across the country. We are expecting the provinces to come back with an accounting of how they've spent that money by next month. It will be 1 year since those agreements all rolled out. But your second project is to do with coordinating among organizations, I believe, across the country. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So with regards to the National Action Plan, sorry, could you clarify your question? What do you mean by coordinating? Do you mean just in our work in general?
So maybe I misunderstand, but I believe that you have a second project funded by Wage in which you're trying to develop a framework or cooperation among women's organizations, but perhaps I'm mistaken or misunderstood.
I mean, it's definitely part of the work that we do. We bring, for example, sexual assault center networks, so provincial and territorial networks from across the country together to really analyze the gaps and the trends and the issues with the National Action Plan and other things. And so that's where our data comes from for the gaps.
Thank you. So let me just, sorry, I have one more quick question before I run out of time. You said that comprehensive sex education as a child in school will prevent gender-based violence.
It would be one of the ways to prevent sexual violence. It's essential because kids need to learn about consent, first of all, from very little. They can learn about like whether they want to give a hug to someone or whether they want their picture taken. And that needs to be integrated from, you know, the first grades up until high school, where they can start talking about structural racism and misogyny and how to navigate a tech world, right? Their online presence. Intimate images, pornography, all these things. They need to learn about consent, healthy relationships, dating, violence, etc.
Thank you, MP Hepner. Next, Adrienne Larouche, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ullman and Ms. Ogivoy, I'll come back to you in another turn, but I would like to add to what I want to build on what you said, Mr. Boisvenu. I wonder if I'm looking for a solution, because in Quebec, that was one of the recommendations of the Rebuilding Confidence report, the question of electronic bracelets. So we have a pilot project in various locations in Quebec to see what works well. And that's what a pilot project is. We look at what goes well, or what's working well, what works less well, but so far I don't think anyone wants to come back to the past. You know, the first observations that we've had with public safety is that nobody wants to come back to the way things were. But despite C-232 that recommended electronic bracelets, you talked about, you know, you said that you didn't understand, you know, what happened at Candiac. You said that judges were maybe not sufficiently educated. So now that we have this bill and that we're at the federal level and Quebec has its own pilot project, why? And we understand that this tool won't settle all the issues, but I'd like to hear what you think. What could we do more other than, you know, beyond just electronic bracelets? Well, the Quebec experience is very conclusive. There are a number of men that among the men who are wearing bracelets, there have been no homicides or no femicides. Now, in one place, the women was not informed, but it is a tool that has worked well. In Spain, almost 8. You know, the case was similar, so it's an effective tool. But when a law is adopted in Canada, it depends, or the Minister of Justice has the responsibility to inform judges of the decision. So because, you know, either, you know, when a law is adopted, there's a decree, and then it goes down into the machine. So the federal government has a role of informing, and I think that's where the importance. So, you know, it's almost as if when we adopt a law, it's just shelved after that. But we need an information strategy so that you can inform the judges throughout the country. So information has to go down, has to trickle down, and the first person responsible is the Minister of Justice at the federal level, and then at the provincial level. So, but it's almost like right now there's no overall strategy nationally to communicate that information to the judges that are sitting in the courts. You know, they meet regularly on legislative change. So when there are tools that are as important as electronic bracelets, we should have a specific strategy because there are lives at stake here. So I hope that answers your question.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I wanted to give you an opportunity, Senator, because I ran out of time.
Vous avez parlé tantôt du C5. On sait que le projet de loi C5.
Earlier, you talked about C5. Bill C5 was adopted under the pretext of an overpopulation in the federal penitentiaries, mainly of Indigenous people. It's true that in the Canadian West especially, there is an overrepresentation, about 17 to 20% Indigenous people, depending on which penitentiary, and 7% of the population is Indigenous. In 1996, the Supreme Court made the Gladue decision and told judges, find alternatives to imprisonment. In 2004 and in 2012, the Supreme Court returned to tell the judges that you have not done your job. We ordered you to find alternatives to imprisonment. So Bill C5 will have no impact on reduction of the Indigenous population in prisons. The proof is in Quebec, 40% of sexual assaulted people will return home. I think there were 3 Indigenous and 37 from the white community. So the criminal code has already a vision to limit as much as possible the amount of imprisonment of Indigenous people.
That was one of the issues I had with Bill C5 is that I don't believe it adequately addressed systemic racism within the justice system. And it actually, and you're absolutely correct in your assertion that it was highly criticized around for those issues. So I don't disagree. We're on the same page there, but I was just mentioning the intent of it. Although I don't think it was totally successful personally. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you were talking about overrepresented populations. You spoke about MMIWG, sex workers, 2SLGBTQ+, disability community. We did a whole study around sex work. My bias is that when you make it illegal, you're actually placing sex workers in greater threat because they can't go to any sort of authority for help because what they're doing is illegal. I know that they're not calling for the calling for the decriminalization they're calling for the decriminalization of sex work, not the legalization of sex work. Do you agree that decriminalizing sex work would make sex workers safer because there's a high rate of violence and often femicide in the case of sex workers?
MP Gazan, unfortunately, you were long past your time. So at any point, if there's questions that are posed that you don't have an opportunity to answer, please feel to submit your answers via writing, or perhaps in the next round you'll have an opportunity to answer. At this point, Dominique, vous avez la parole pour 5 minutes.
You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and hello to all our witnesses. Senator Boisvenu, I'm happy to see you again. It's really a pleasure. I don't have much time, so I'll get right into the topic. I would like to take a different approach. There are about 20 feminicides in Quebec so far, 24, so it's exponential. It's a record year. 2021, there were 22. It's terrible. You said initially in your comments that violence against women ought to be a concern for men. On December 6th, it's approaching that Pali. Women were killed simply because they were women. And there's a movement, Senator Boisvenu, concerning masculinism and fairly toxic comments toward women. We heard that on the TV show Tout le monde en parle 2 weeks ago. Millions of men follow influencers who take an approach and a posture toward women that make the hair stand up on the back of my neck, that women should be submissive and have no leadership. There seems to be an escalation underway of placing women in a setting that we no longer wish to be in, obviously. For you, Senator Boisvenu, when you have heard these kinds of comments from men who are given a microphone, and we're in a free society, people have the right to speak out. I agree with that, but their comments are quite disturbing. How do you respond when men are putting across on podcasts and on the radio and on TV with a big audience these kinds of comments? What does that tell you? I think that the media in question lack responsibility, and nor do I agree with photographs of serial killers being published. I think that when a woman is murdered, it's the woman who ought to be protected, the image of the woman and not that of the murderer. So the debating of controversial topics that can ultimately result in violence in some cases, I find that it's a lack of responsibility. It's not the kind of information that ought to be put across, especially on the state-owned radio waves. I am very cautious about having those men being publicly exposed. There are too many people on the social networks already without exposing them on national or giving them exposure on national networks. Senator Boisvenu, you said initially that the charter ought to have been upgraded, that the government should have upgraded the Victims' Bill of Rights. And as regards the points that you raised, to consult the families of victims on whether or not an accused should be released. How can you improve that Bill of Rights to make it more restrictive? Is the Bill of Rights restrictive? How does it work in real life? First of all, the Bill of Rights has weaknesses, as you said. It's a vehicle, as I said earlier, it's a vehicle with four wheels and an engine. It can stay in the backyard if you don't put any gas in it. And if you put gas in, but you don't maintain it, then it won't cover much mileage. So that's what you have to do to bring energy into it. An example, the Bill of Rights was adopted, and in the following 2 years after that, the government had to adopt a process for the management of complaints. That was not done. And in fact, if this process had been adopted, the official process for handling complaints, that charter, that Bill of Rights would now have a better way of handling complaints. Can you give us an example, Senator Boisvenu, of what would be a complaint and how it ought to be handled? Correctional services, for example, releases an individual at 2/3 of the sentence, but who is still dangerous, but the victim is not informed. The parole board receives someone for a hearing, an inmate, but the family is not invited. And the charter applies. First of all, the Bill of Rights is supra-constitutional. It's above all the laws, and the organizations are required to comply with this law. It's a law, and the ministers too. It's legislation. That's why I brought 3 bills before the Senate to enrich the Bill of Rights. I gave the example earlier of photographs posted by an individual. So I introduced legislation, and another one concerning release on parole so that the victim could ask questions to the offender. Only a lawyer can ask questions. The families are not represented, but the criminal has a lawyer representing him or her before the board. So I introduced legislation so that when there's a process or there's a hearing, the victim's family could be on the same, or the victim could be on the same footing. It's not the case now. Thank you. So these are little details maybe to you, but to the family that is victimized, it's huge. It's huge when you forget that in the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, all the witnesses, for your incitement testimony. My first questions to Ms. Warrior. Ms. Warrior, your organization has one of your team's publication brings up the idea that we want to prevent gender-based violence, so we need to ensure the children grow up in a safe and healthy environment. Could you tell us more about that and elaborate that the children are in the safe environment? How can be, as a part of the violence prevention?
Thank you for the question. So for sure, that is so key. So early intervention, we would like to see supports for parents, for children who witness violence, for children who experience violence, better supports for youth exiting the child welfare system. Often that is a key kind of recruiting ground for human traffickers, so our group homes. So we need more supports. Like I said, comprehensive sex education in schools is so important, and not the type that you have to opt in. I would love to see the federal government take some leadership on common standards across the country. I know that it's a provincial matter, but we've seen the government take the lead on different matters, and I think it's possible to have at least standards for comprehensive sex education. We need, free mental health supports, healing supports, for addiction supports for men and for everyone. And really just funding of women's organizations that exist but struggle. They're chronically underfunded. And so they do good prevention work. They work in schools, and often that work is not even funded. It's not part of their core funding. And maybe just another piece is addressing the online culture, the manosphere. Some of you mentioned this already, but all the misogyny online, that's an important piece as well. I could go on, but...
Thank you. My next question is to Senator Bamniou. Senator Bamniou, you said that we need a national information strategy, but I'm MP from Brampton, from Ontario. In Ontario, most criminal cases in provincially run courts in Ontario are now ending before charges are testing and trials. And we heard from even the CBC a couple of weeks ago, criminal cases stayed for unreasonable delay in Ontario since a Jordan decision. Even though to fix the justice system, there's a shortage of court staff, prosecutors, courtrooms. What are you saying on this?
En 2015,
In 2015, or 2014 rather, the Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs of the Senate did an exhaustive study of court delays. The Runciman report, he was the chair of the committee, the Honorable Mr. Runciman, and in that report there were some 67 recommendations for the courts. I do not know if 10 of them have been implemented, because we looked over all the issues, but the major issues for Canadian courts, as the culture of the report, when I see spousal violence cases where it's the 10th, 15th, or 20th delays, rather the delays. When I saw the delays of the hearings, when I saw in Saint-Jérôme, 37 delays or postponements. So there's a generalized culture in Canada of what they said, that there's a culture of postponements, a lack of discipline in the courts. Sure, there's a shortage of labor. It's a case in Quebec. We have a shortage of court clerks and technical support for lawyers. And I think the main cause for the courts is this culture of the postponements. And at one point, when a sexual assault case, the individual who is accused, who is at the 15th or 20th time, the judge will have to put their foot down and say that's enough. The kind of feedback I get from women who are in spousal violence cases, it's the abusive use of legal procedures. And in Quebec, it's clear, the Minister of Justice has clearly stated that there are people who do assaults and they use these procedures to delay it because 50% of the victims will give up in sexual assault. 50% of victims give up in the course of the procedures. So I think that the Minister of Justice of Canada, with the provincial colleagues, should take that matter as a priority, take it on as a priority, so that these habits can be changed that have set in over the past 10 or 15 years. Or now, let's say, continually having delays and postponements, which is disruptive for the victims because they give up. Thank you.
MP Ferrari, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you again for all of this. I think it's critical that we get to the crux of how we actually implement change. And I think one of the things, I'll keep calling you Senator Boisvenu, Honorable Boisvenu has said, I remember he said this and it really, really stuck with me. We've seen an increase in crime in this country, over 100%. And you said to me, for every criminal, for every incident of crime, there is an increase in victims. That really stuck with me because that increase in crime is an increase in victims. You came before this committee 1 year to the day ago, and we were studying one of the most powerful bills that you had written, S-205. This was one of the many things you did in honor of your daughter, Julie, who was murdered, and it was an amazing bill to protect victims and keep women and victims safe. And it was passed, and that was good. It was adopted, but it was extremely disappointing because many of your parts of the bill that had a lot of meat and potatoes were cut off by the Liberals and NDP. So Section 515, the provisions concerning intimate partner consultation on security matters as well as the wearing of electronic bracelets have been removed. Commitment Order 810, the initial duration of the order has been reduced to 1 year. It was initially 2 years. The extension of the order that was set at a maximum of 2 years, it was 3 years initially. Refusal to contract an 810 prescription. This is the prison sentence for refusal was reduced to 1 year. It was initially 2 years. So you can see all of these has been reduced, not increased. And the other 810 changes, the imposing condition of refraining from using social media was also removed. You said in your opening statement we need to toughen up on criminals, and yet these things were cut out of S-205. Can you please explain how these cuts affect your bill and what we can do to fix this and help restore safety to victims?
Merci beaucoup pour les questions. Je vais y aller par...
Thank you for the question. I'll go in order. First of all, it's the existence of the 810s and 515s that were not increased to 2 years and all that. There was a reason for that. The reason is that often in the case of 515, the trial will take 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years. And if the order only lasts 1 year, then the criminal will go back to the victim and to force her to give up her complaint or to harass her. That's why we put longer timelines so that the victim can be protected at least for the duration of the trial. Why would we put an example of 810 orders where there's a lack of respect of the 810 order and they put a longer sentence? Because the University of Montreal did a study in Quebec on the compliance with 810s, and 50% of the men were not respecting the conditions set by the court. So if there are no consequences when you have an order not to approach the victim, but you do so, and there are no consequences, then the men become aware of this. The attackers become aware of this because there are no consequences. And it's important for us in this legislation, if the individual does not comply with the conditions, that there should be some minimum consequences. And the social networks, they took that out as well. This was the main tool used for harassment of the victims, especially over Facebook, and you took that out. So what you took out from that bill is everything that makes it so that the criminals will keep on harassing the victims. You made the wrong target by taking that out of the legislation. That's where the victims felt some confidence because they were given tools, but you took out consultation of the victims when a 510 order is made and what means of protection they have. That was taken out.
Je comprenais pas votre raisonnement.
I couldn't understand your reasoning. Taking things out that are the consequences often of harassment and intimidation of the victims.
That took it out. It was certainly not the Conservatives. We fought very hard to keep that part in the bill, and it was very disheartening to have that through. And, you know, it was either pick your poison. We had to pass that bill, but it was so weakened by what the Liberals and NDP took out of it, exactly to your point. And it's very hard to comprehend why they would want to do that. And I know we're probably out of time, but if you ever want to submit that to committee as to why you think they did that, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
MP Demoff, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm happy to get some more time with these witnesses. Before I start with questions, though, I want to echo what my colleague, Ms. Hepner, was saying about Jordan. I share her concerns. It makes me absolutely sick that in Ontario, from 2016 to 2023, 580 cases have been stayed and 145 were sexual assaults. Now, we have a constitution in Canada, and provinces are responsible for the administrative of justice. And it was a Supreme Court decision which we actually relitigated, and the courts basically sent us packing. So we've been trying to work with the provinces in Ontario, provinces and territories. But for me in Halton, it's personal because in 2017, a new courthouse was announced. It was to start construction in 2019 and it would be finished in 2023. So we would have had a year of this new courthouse that featured new technology to make the court run more efficiently. And instead, we're dealing with a courthouse where jurors are being interviewed in the cafeteria and judges refuse to sit because of mold and asbestos. And it is absolutely tragic that the province of Ontario they put $29 million into the courts, and the president of the Ontario Crown said that Ontario's investment doesn't even come close to what is needed. So I share the concern that the witnesses have expressed about this. I think we all do. But I think my question to you, Ms. Voyer, is we have limited ability we can't tell the provinces what to do, but would you agree with me that provinces and territories need to step up to make investments in the courts so that they can run efficiently?
Well, yes and no. So yes, I believe that survivors who want to get protection from the court and who want to report to the police should have access to, processes that are timely, that are survivor-centered, and that are trauma-informed. They should also get the free legal advice to navigate that. However, like I said, I also think we need to take that step back and see the broader picture when we're talking about gender-based violence and not only focus on, the courts. So yes and no.
I agree with you, except, we had Kate Alexander testify and gave us very powerful testimony about her feelings in her case being dismissed because of these issues. And I think that those women and men who are brave enough to go into the court system, it's not an easy decision to make in the first place. If they've made that really difficult decision to pursue the courts, that they shouldn't be faced with these decisions because we have literally a rotting courthouse in Halton where they can't get a timely trial. And I've had women reach out to me, both from family court and criminal court, with their cases, and it's absolutely tragic. Just changing direction a little bit, Ms. Voyer, you talked about data collection. And one of the things that we know that women are more at risk if there's a firearm in the home to a femicide. And I'm just wondering if you would support additional data collection on the use of firearms in gender-based violence.
Yes, for sure. And I think the work that you put in Bill C-21 was really important in limiting the use of assault-style firearms. So yes, I think we need accountability around that, because right now there's regulations that are going to be put in place to make sure that that bill is enacted, but we need to make sure that it is done in a way that works for survivors. And I would refer you to NAL, the National Association of Women in the Law's work on this, because they have been working on how to implement the regulations, as well as Police se souvient.
Yes, actually, I worked with Noel to make sure that those amendments did get into Bill C-21, that will see firearms removed from the House within 24 hours of a prohibition order, because right now that's not the case. And even in Bill C-71, firearms owners had to surrender their firearms to the Crown, and that was new. So if in the past they could just give it to a buddy or a brother who had a firearms license. So would you agree that that is also important legislation that we've put in place?
Without knowing the details of the bill, but yes, it's important for perpetrators to surrender their firearms as soon as possible when there is evidence of.
I had a friend who was in that situation, and her husband, it was before the bill was passed, and her husband's guns were actually given to his brother because he had a firearms license, and she was terrified that her husband knew where the brother kept his guns. His brother was a fine individual, but I mean, that was, having them surrendered to the Crown would have given her an awful lot of peace of mind. Thank you, Chair.
MP LaRouche, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. In 5 days, on November 25th in Quebec, we're going to announce days of action, 2 action days against violence against women, which will wind up on December 6th with commemoration of the Polytechnic. And I would also like to mention group of feminist women in Quebec, which is launching an Operation Tendre la Main, reaching out. So, Ms. Auger-Voyer, I'd like to direct my question to you, because you raised this online, but I don't know how to reach out in the current context with these masculinist or misogynist movements that's increasing everywhere. I don't know how to reach out anymore. And this is happening a lot online. I'd like to tie this in with December 6th. Why is it the groups of influencers, in particular the incel, who encourage Marc Lépine, who deify him even now in 2024? I really don't know what to do with that anymore, because quite frankly, I don't want to cut off anyone's freedom of speech, but I think at one point we're going to have to look into how far it can go and what can become something intolerable and in a criminal sense. Certain comments in certain spheres on the dark web, at one point we're going to have to look into that without violating anyone's freedom of speech, but some legislation on the hateful content online to avoid these kinds of online remarks that contribute to this kind of toxic masculinity and misogyny. What do you think about that? Because we hear that more and more at the federal level of what should be done about hateful online comments like that.
Very much a backlash against women and against feminists in particular too, online. And we're hearing young men in the US right now saying, "Your body, my choice." They're very much emboldened by the types of narratives that they're hearing, by that rape culture narrative and the skewed gender norms. So I do think it is important to act on misogyny online, and we would like to see the government actually name that as a type of hate when they are working on bills such as C-63.
MP Gazan, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
So maybe if I know that I asked about sex work, decriminalizing sex work, can you send that in writing for me? Because I wanted you to speak a little bit about an independent commissioner to oversee progress on gender-based violence. Call for Justice 1.7 of the National Inquiry calls for that. The federal government commissioned a study on that in terms of how to implement it, yet to act on it, which is deeply troubling. Just to oversee action or no action on MMIWG, we know there's been barely any action. And certainly on gender-based violence, we have solutions to end gender-based violence. We just lack the political will. And we're focusing on things after the fact when it's too late. I have so many women who were murdered in my community. Sometimes, like it's like a regular occurrence. We're in a constant state of grief. It is a crisis, but it's too late. And it's not that I don't support forms of justice. I just feel like we need to focus on prevention. You spoke a lot about prevention. And why is it important to have oversight to ensure that things are being put in place that will save lives?
Thank you. That's a great question. So yes, just to reiterate, Indigenous women's organizations are pointing out that only 2 of the 231 calls for justice have been completely implemented, which is hugely problematic. So yes, we want to see accountability. So we're happy that there's a national action plan, but we need oversight and we need accountability with input from our sector. Otherwise, it's left to provincial governments to do whatever they want with the money. And it's not necessarily guided by expertise, subject matter expertise. So LEAF recently tabled a report called What It Takes, Establishing a GBV Accountability Mechanism in Canada. So I urge you to look at that. I know a lot of members of the committee were at the launch of the report, and it also builds on the Mass Casualty Commission's recommendation to establish a GBV commissioner. So I can tell you what the purpose would be. So it would be to harmonize efforts across jurisdictions, to track the progress, to monitor and evaluate, to look at the compliance with international human rights obligations, to collect data and research. It would also play have advisory functions, so liaise with advocates from marginalized groups. It would increase the transparency and as well as public awareness and prevention. So this is really, really a key part of the picture, because right now the National Action Plan is also dependent on election cycles, and we need more than that. We need something more sustainable for accountability.
And in terms of data collection, why is it important to ensure that we collect disaggregated data in the study of JBV? I know we want to lump everybody together, but why is it important to ensure that we collect disaggregated data?
It's important because there are certain groups that are disproportionately affected, such as the ones I mentioned earlier: Indigenous women, women with disabilities, trans. Today is the Trans Day of Remembrance, and so it's really important to be able to distinguish those different identities and also intersecting identities when looking at data. Otherwise, we come up with solutions that fit one group but doesn't fit others or doesn't capture the reality of other groups.
Being cut off. I had 5 million questions.
Thank you. Anna, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Esther, I'm going to ask you this. There has been a lot of conversation, as we just heard, about rehabilitation and talk about teaching what is healthy touch here today. Can I ask you about the man who murdered your aunt? Did he come from an abusive home? So
he's a member of my extended family. He's my dad's ex-brother-in-law, so I know his parents actually quite well, because my dad was married to his sister for almost 20 years.
Oh. And so I guess rehabilitation doesn't work, clearly. And what I don't understand, I'm going to go back to the Jordan law. I think we have to change that. Because, you know, earlier, I can't remember which one of my colleagues brought up Kate Alexander, who came to this committee and testified and was left for dead. And because of the Jordan law, her ex-boyfriend, if you want to call him that, he got off. And it wasn't the first time. And she can't do a thing about it, and she can't say anything about it because it never went to court. This man is free to roam the streets to abuse other women. So do you agree, I'm going to ask both of you this question, that we have to look at that Jordan law and revamp it to protect women? I'll ask both of you if you think that that has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Senator?
Moi, je pense qu'il faudrait se servir de la clause non-obstant.
I believe we should use the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to suspend the Supreme Court decision in specific cases. Because cases at the civil level where the delays are shorter compared to the criminal cases often have less impact. But in the case of crimes such as murders or sexual assault, I think it would be necessary for Parliament to use the notwithstanding clause in those cases to tell the Supreme Court to review its decision.
With some police officers from York Region in my riding, and I said to them, like, why is this happening? It's happening in a community, in a small hamlet of where I live. The crime has gone through the roof. And one of the things that was said to me, which left me shocked, I'll be totally honest, is that the criminals are saying, hey, we can get away with murder here in Canada because the law is on our side, not on the victim's side. So they have no, you're right, there's no consequences. So we need to change the Bill of Rights to protect women. Do you agree with that, Esther, Senator?
Yeah, I know in the case of my aunt's killer, he was always a bad guy, but the lack of accountability allowed him to get progressively worse because he'd do something, he'd get away with it, and then he'd do something a little bit worse, and then he'd do something a little bit worse until it came to the point of murder. So, like, the lack of accountability led us to this point. Maybe had he had the proper punishment for his previous offenses, maybe we wouldn't have come to this.
Senator?
Il y a tant de choses à changer dans le système.
There are so many things that need to be changed in the system, so many things. I'm just thinking about reciprocity between provinces. If you're a woman and you're in Ontario and you come to Quebec and you're assaulted, it's not covered by Ontario or Quebec because there are barriers between the provinces, because it's up to the provinces. But the criminal will commit a crime in Ontario and be incarcerated in Quebec. There are the same programs throughout Canada. One day we'll need to have minimal standards for the victims. It's not normal for Newfoundland that has no program, and Quebec has good programs. Ontario, relatively, the provinces are. The problem is that if you are traveling in a province and you're a victim, you will not be helped by anyone because the crime has to happen in the province where you live. It's been years I've talked to the Minister of Justice at the federal level to say, have discussions with your provincial partners to have reciprocity agreements between provinces. If Quebec is ready to help, for example, Quebec victims that were a victim in Ontario, but if Ontario does the same thing, you understand? I think this is a huge barrier to victim assistance, that often those victims are not helped in whatever province. There are so many things that need to be done. I would have to get back into politics.
To ensure, if we want to ensure the protection of women, the law must be the same for every single province so that women can walk free and safe no matter where they are. Okay.
Thank you. At this point, MP Saray, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Un gros merci à nos témoins.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much to our witnesses. A lot of information, and it's difficult to, we understand that as regards the victims, we heard clearly about the need for change. Of course, we know the province and the federal level and the municipal and local levels, a lot of things. But my first question, Senator Boisvenu, we can still call you Senator. Thank you for your years of service. You talked about therapy for men. We heard a bit about, let's say, therapy. I think we can say that it's a joke at the moment, a few days here and there with a bunch of men together. So you talked about, of course, your experience in Quebec, but Do you have any examples to give us at the federal level of what we can do in order to look into, well, we have political parties here with national standards, and with the provinces, it's always not easy. So we heard from the witnesses that we should have national standards, but there is a provincial jurisdiction. But what is your recommendation to deal with that problem today for therapy for men, which is virtually non-existent? You're quite right, and thank you for the question. We should have the same approach in terms of the funding that the federal government had with the women's shelters for women victims. Ontario is quite advanced and has 6 centers for treatment of violent men and has had some good success. In the Canadian West, for the Indigenous people, they also have violence treatment centers that provide good results. In Ontario, I think that, well, in Quebec, I think there are 2 centers. It's a 6-month waiting period. So a violent man, you have to wait 6 months. There's a great chance of repeat offending. Resources have to be injected into that, and the men have to be sent for therapy. There is no other way. Women have to be protected, and men have to be treated.
You mentioned, Esther, you mentioned a bit online, because we know currently there's an online Arms Act right now in Parliament. It's been delayed, it's been held up, and I don't know if it's free speech issues or not. But I wanted to get your opinion from TikTok, Instagram. I'm older, so I just kind of follow Facebook. I don't necessarily follow. I mean, X is just a cesspool of hate, so I don't even look at that. But I wanted to get your sense of what can the federal government or the provincial governments or any governments do to kind of deal with the online hate that you're seeing, for example.
Well, I mean, in my aunt's case, online hate wasn't really an issue. The perpetrator was just he liked to commit crimes against women. And I don't think that anything that he saw online encouraged him to do that, because he was like that before social media was really a thing. Like, he's 54 and he's kind of been like this since he was young. Obviously, he wasn't committing murders. But I can't say I'm 100% familiar with what you're referring to, but in regards to my aunt's case, it wouldn't have made a difference.
Ms. Auger-Evoyer, you indicated earlier about, like, we've heard a lot of witnesses, and, you know, when we look at federal government, provincial government, we have the Premier of Ontario, Mr. Ford, that's just saying it's all a federal issue. Victims are tired of hearing, you know, the federal, provincial aspects, and because, you know, it's complicated. The laws that are not necessarily being implemented or applied equally across provinces, and the lack of resources. And what, I know you mentioned some recommendations, but in light of what you heard today, do you have any other specific recommendations, and it either federally or provincially? Because right now, when we look at the lack of courts and staff and training, it's really a systemic problem from A to Z. There is no support for victims, no lawyers assigned to them. So do you have any, like, really, I don't know, the time that we have left, like 3 others, recommendations for the federal government or provincial governments, because they are sitting together and talking, but it's not necessarily going fast enough?
So, sorry, just, are you talking in general, or are you talking for the criminal justice system?
The criminal justice system, yes.
Okay, so yes. First, make processes that are survivor-centered and trauma-informed, so where the victims, safety needs are taken into consideration, and where processes are adapted to their needs, and especially those most marginalized. Free legal advice and representation for victims. There are pilots of that for sexual assault, and so those should be expanded. Also investing in alternative forms of accountability, because again, I said survivors are looking for accountability, so things like transformative restorative justice initiatives. Investing more in rehabilitation, so like as we've talked about, it's very much a patchwork right now, and for example in Ontario, PAR programs, partner assault response programs, used to be 24 sessions. They're now 12 or 16. I think they went to 16, now they're 12. During the pandemic, I ran one of them, and it was only 6 sessions. This is vastly insufficient. Addressing the delays in court that we were all talking about, as well as finding services, frontline services that provide supports to survivors throughout the process and accompany them. and are there regardless of whether they want to report or not. And maybe lastly, implement the red dress alert. That's a really important one as well that the
Thank
federal
you.
government can work on.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Saray. So at this point, group, we're going to go into a fourth round. Traditionally, fourth round, I have room for 25 minutes. In a fourth round, we don't have 25 minutes. So I'm going to shorten that. So we will have a 13-minute round, 4, 4, 2.5, 2.5. Okay, so we'll move forward to begin our fourth round. We started at 4:31, so we have a minute's grace. Dominique, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Senator Boisvenu, I'd like to have a clarification about therapy for men, because often we've discussed that the guys need help too. I think everyone agrees with that. And if we want rehabilitation to exist, we need to give a nudge there. Do we have to oblige to make it mandatory or for therapy, or in some cases therapy is forced on them, or it's obligatory, mandatory? First of all, it's 30 days firm therapy. And experience with Indigenous groups in the Canadian West, they measured, in fact, for the men that were required to go there by court and those that went voluntarily. And the degree of rehabilitation is the same, because one that goes there and is forced to, after 2 or 3 sessions, they kind of catch on and they continue. So they're not more dropouts, whether ordered by court or whether they go voluntarily. Some women have told us here in various studies that we've conducted that they don't trust the police. You said that earlier, that you have great respect for the police force and the work that they do, but traumatization that they get involved in, everyone is aware of that, but women have told us that they don't trust them. What can you advise us? What ought we to do, or what recommendation could you make to improve this relationship of trust, having infallible technical methods to ensure that when a woman reports something, that the evidence she has is infallible before the court? Electronic bracelet, the use of cell phones, a project we have in Quebec, a woman can take videos or audio. It doesn't go into her cell phone, it goes into a center and cannot be erased. And this is irrefutable before the court. Historically, the problem has been the word of the woman against the man's word. No, I didn't go on the street there, I didn't go on the balcony, and the police were caught with that, whom they had to believe. Whereas with an electronic bracelet and with cell phones, the new means we have today, this is evidence that is irrefutable and is accepted by the court. And this is something that, in my opinion, will be good tools for the police, resulting in not having to continue to repeat that. Once they have replaced it, it's because they already believed the woman, because I'm talking about upstream of that, we should look into it. With the cell phone, not to go in court just for that. An example, once you're a victim of violence, in Quebec, they pay for the device. Senator Boisvenu, if you want to, well, I'm sure we can find support in the next government. What are the 4 or 5 priorities that we ought to have in the first 100 days? What would be the guidelines? What should we do? My gosh. Well, listen, I think, first of all, regarding murdered women, when a man rapes a woman and kills her, an unknown one, it's automatically a first-degree murder. A man who rapes his spouse or ex-spouse and murders her, he'll do 5 years in prison. So why don't we have the same degree of severity against a man who sexually assaults his wife and murders her than if he murders an unknown person and assaults her? It would be a priority to tell men that murder is unacceptable in our society. And what's unacceptable is that they do 5 years of prison. Another thing is prison is not an avenue for violent men except extreme cases. What the women tell us is that when you give a guy 6 months in prison, he comes out even more violent. So you have to substitute prison for rehabilitation because it's the same cost, $80,000 a year for someone in prison. If you send someone to therapy, it maybe cost $20,000 or $30,000. So we need to replace the short prison sentences that do nothing. There's no therapy in the provincial jails for replace it with rehabilitation. I think we need to put priority on that, and then reciprocity between provinces for victim assistance. I think that's a priority that the Minister of Justice should give us. Send us your priorities. Thank you. We'll await that.
MP Hepner, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
Sorry to confuse you, Chair.
It's all good.
This has been a really valuable conversation. I want to thank you all for your insights. I want to go back to this idea. We've talked about it before at this committee. My colleague MP Dimmoff brought it up, and I think it's one of your recommendations, Valerie, that we appoint a lawyer for victims. And I want to dig into this a little bit more. How do you envision this working out? I mean, I love this idea because in my court experience, I heard this all the time. Victims don't feel like they're being heard. The Crown is not there for them. They have wonderful people in victim services who work through courts to help guide them through the process, but that person isn't advocating for them before the judge. I would like to see this at family court as well, with a lawyer for the victim who is knowledgeable about gender-based violence and coercive control and things like this. With this, I'm just, I don't know if you know, but is this a criminal code change, or how do you envision this rolling out?
Honestly, that's a very good question. I don't have a legal background myself, so I know the same as you do, that survivors don't feel like they're heard. They're just, at the moment, they're just a witness to the crime against them. And so they don't feel that their needs matter, that there's anyone really there to represent them, to explain the system to them, because the prosecutors can do some of that, but don't necessarily kind of have to, or don't have the time, or and so they really need someone with legal expertise that can really guide them through the process and advise them.
And I would add somebody who is given standing to speak at the court case, which the victims don't always have. But I want to move into a different area, because I know that your organization works with groups that support women on the front lines, organizations that combat gender-based violence. And I know from all my conversations with all my stakeholders who work in this field, it's been a really tough time for the frontline workers in this field. What can we do more to support them, to support their mental health, to support them through all that they're going through, so that they can continue their vital work of supporting women who are victims of violence?
I'm so glad you asked that. So actually, our organization has been working on a roadmap to build supports for the gender-based violence workforce. So that's based on surveying frontline workers, as well as all the research that's been done in Canada on this topic. And we've created some priorities. And one of the recommendations that we're asking from the federal government is to create a national kind of labor force strategy for the gender-based violence workforce, because there are so many common systemic issues that they're facing. So, not just the trauma that they're experiencing and hearing every day, but the barriers of all the systems that they're working with that are very frustrating on the daily basis. But not just that, it's a caring job that's done mostly by women, and mostly by women of color, Indigenous and Black and women of color. And so just like the care economy, we could see that those jobs are very much undervalued, underpaid, no benefits, no pensions. And so it's really a systemic issue, and that needs to be fixed by a national labor strategy.
Chair, I'm not sure how much time I have, 20 seconds? Okay. Maybe I'll just go back to the project that I was kind of unsure about before I was asking. I think the project is more about forming a network, so that you have, so that everybody's kind of on the same page across the country. Can you talk a little bit about that project in the 10 seconds we have left?
Sure. So I host a national working group on sexual violence, and it's the only place nationally that sexual assault center representatives can come and talk about the trends and the gaps and the challenges, and that's what informs then our work and our recommendations. So so we really look at all of the gaps across the country, across jurisdictions.
Excellent, thank you. MP LaRouche, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Of course, I don't have much time in the last round. Just quickly, because I have another question after Ms. Ullman, but you talked about Bill C-5, and I had discussions with the Justice spokesperson who did everything to divide Bill C-5, but the government didn't listen, particularly to withdraw from Bill C-5 crimes against women, which could have been an important facet to work, to collaborate in order to divide that and to separate out crimes concerning women. Would that have helped your aunt to be able to continue to maintain minimum sentences for crimes against women when we say that the government didn't listen to us and did not want to divide the bill?
Theoretically, if there had been some sort of mandatory minimum sentencing for my aunt's killer, he would have either been being monitored, he would have been either in jail or in some sort of system that was monitoring him so he could not commit this crime against my aunt and my family.
Merci.
Thank you.
Monsieur.
Thank you. Mr. Boisvenu, for my last question, first I have a comment and then a question. In the case of S-205, the issue of removing the maximum time for good behavior, reducing it from 2 years to 1 year, the criminals can be very vindictive, and that's when it can become dangerous because animosity toward an ex-spouse can continue. So we don't understand why that timeline was reduced in that way in Bill 205. And the other thing is that you talked about one of the major problems of the justice system is the culture of postponements. Can we give an example, set the example at the federal level, why there are so many judges' positions that have not been filled when we talk about a shortage of labor and giving us the tools we need for the justice system the government has not given us by filling those judge positions and this culture of delay. Obviously, I think that over 80 judge positions at the Superior Court are vacant, but I would like to answer the lady's question. Quebec gives legal support to victims of sexual assault and spousal violence, but only advice. The justice system should be 3 parts. There should be defense, the Crown, and the victim with a lawyer, like in France. And then they each have the same rights. A victim can appeal a decision. A victim could be able to question that. In the French system, it's very balanced in that regard. The victim is represented in the system, the Crown, and the criminal. So in our system in Canada, the victim is not represented, but is just a witness. So that's what needs to be changed. So that's your Bill 233. No, 255 rather. S-255 is it? S-255 is considered femicide when there's a previous conviction and is considered first degree, because femicide is always a consequence of a situation of violence that continues in the course of time, and the conclusion is always one of murder. So it should be considered as premeditated murder.
Thank you. So, folks, this does conclude our panel for. Oh, Leah, pardon.
Oh my goodness, did you see the
Leah, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Please proceed.
My final question actually goes to you, Senator. I was interested in what you said about short sentences, that in the case of short sentences that we need to look at rehabilitation. And I'm thinking about, for example, restorative justice. Part of the reason I say that is I was trained on how to train incarcerated persons with, because I taught in university with students on the outside, with students on the inside at the Grand Valley Institute, in fact, what's in the news recently. And my observations from that training was this: you can't teach pro-social behavior in an anti-social environment. And our goal is, of course, to eradicate violence. Like, that's the whole point of this, is to end gender-based violence. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more your thoughts on rehabilitation programs maybe being a potential better option for short sentences.
Il faut s'attaquer. La violence conjugale, il faut.
We need to deal with spousal violence. We have to deal with repeat offending. So assailants who are the third or fourth spouse, they're the ones that have to be dealt with. But an assailant who is in court for the first time, in all cases, this person should be sent for therapy, not wait until he does a second or third time. That's how we did previously with drinking and driving. They did it 3 or 4 or 5 times, and they waited till he got really drunk and killed someone. Spousal violence, we have to step in right away at the first opportunity, because these are behaviors that have been going on for a long time. So if we don't intervene immediately, we're just going to see it, in Quebec, the degree of criminals returning to prison is 8 times the average. So if we don't intervene quickly, the first time there's a court appearance, this person, those are the ones that fill up the courthouses. So I would say that for spousal violence, as soon as a young man, 22, 23, is before a judge, right away there should be therapy.
There's a push against this. And for shorter sentences, what concerns me is somebody is incarcerated for 2 years, where there's a tendency to increase violent behaviors. They're let out with no therapy. They're more dangerous. Would you agree with that? In shorter cases, I'm not talking about repeat offenses, but...
On m'a toujours prêté d'être tough on crime.
We always... I was always told I was tough on crime. I'm tough on repeat offenders. So what I'm saying is, when a criminal appears for the first time before a judge, everyone has a first chance. Everyone is entitled to a first chance, but that chance is going to be accompanied with responsibility, which we don't have. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. That does officially conclude our panel for today. I'd certainly like to offer my heartfelt thank you to all the witnesses for your sensitive testimony. And if I could just have the members hold put for just a minute. I would also like to remind the witnesses, if indeed you were ever asked questions that you didn't have an opportunity to respond to, please feel free to submit any written responses to the clerk if you didn't have an opportunity to respond to a question that was posed. Lastly, before we do adjourn the meeting, just a minute's worth of housekeeping. Today's Wednesday, the 20th. On Monday, the 25th, we have our 6th meeting of gender-based violence and femicides. We have more witnesses than we have space. So is it the agreement of the room or the will of the room to bump the 27th meeting, so the Wednesday? We have half of the meeting with the group of Ukrainian parliamentarians. The second half, instead of doing drafting instructions, do you want to host the additional witnesses that are willing to? It would be a 7th or 6.5 meetings then for the study. Are we good with that?
Chair, I had my hand up, but I wasn't sure if you'd see it. One of the witnesses that I'd really like to hear from is the ombudsperson for the victims of crime. I had submitted him as a witness, and I'm hoping that if we do an extra meeting that he can be included in that.
Check back. I know that there was definitely several more. Those that were submitted, we're trying to get as many in as possible, so I can confirm who they were, but I know there were 2 for 3 for certain that weren't able to fit into Mondays. So I think it's the will of the room that we'll go ahead for the extra half meeting on Wednesday. Perfect. Meeting to adjourn. Motion to adjourn. Yes.